You are listening to the Novel Writing Podcast, episode 225. I'm your host, Colleen Mitchell. Grab a cup, cozy up, and let's get to writing. Today I'm talking with Thomas Umstattd Jr., an award-winning speaker, host of the Novel Marketing Podcast and the Christian Publishing Show, and co-host of the YouTube Author Update Show. He's also known for Author Media, a family business helping authors learn how to build a platform, sell more books, and change the world with writing worth talking about. Thomas, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Colleen.
I'm very excited to dive into this topic of social media without, or not necessarily social media, but marketing without sucking your soul out. For listeners unfamiliar with you or your work, how did you get into helping authors with marketing?
So I started off in the 2000s building websites for authors, and that led to speaking at writers' conferences and consulting authors on marketing. And eventually it led to me becoming the marketing director for a publishing company and a literary agent and hosting the Novel Marketing Podcast, which is now the longest running book marketing podcast in the world. So we've seen many book marketing trends come, go, sometimes come back and sometimes go away again. So things go in and out of popularity. They oscillate back and forth. So we have learned what works always works, what sometimes works, and what used to work and what doesn't work anymore.
So kind of like fashion trends when they come back and you're like, no, not bell bottoms again.
Yeah, for men, it's wide ties and skinny ties. It's just the pendulum back and forth.
So what's a recent one that's come back that you maybe didn't expect?
So launch teams are coming back. They worked really well. They've actually always worked, but there was a lot of sloppy book launch team practices that caused people to fall out of favor with them, and they don't universally work. And this is another important distinction, something I've learned over time, that other than having an email list and a website, and even with some exceptions with those two things, there's no marketing techniques that work universally. There's a lot depends on your genre and your strengths and your weaknesses and your readers. And you have to look at those things when putting together a book marketing strategy. And some topics like launch teams, they work really well for some kinds of books and don't work very well for others. And a lot depends on, for launch teams particularly, does your fan base have a tribe? Do they hang out together? Do they like each other? Do they admit that they read your book, your genre? So it works really well for like fantasy and sci-fi, or for anything with a nonfiction cause-based motivation. So I feel like I'm getting us back to true America, whatever that is. And you have people who agree with you with what true America is. They rally to your novel or to your nonfiction. It doesn't work well for, say, steamy romance, because a lot of readers of steamy romance don't want to be publicly associated with the steamy romance that they're reading. And so what you'll see in the author community are romance authors being like, I tried X strategy and it didn't work. Therefore, X strategy doesn't work. And this is a fundamental fallacy, because what they've learned is that strategy doesn't work for them. And what you have to do as a marketer is look and see, did this not work for you because you did it wrong, or because it's not a good strategy for you specifically?
So on the subject of finding those people in those tribes, something I try to help people with, but it's also a struggle for me, is where do those people hang out that's not social media? Because I personally hate social media. I don't want to be on it. I'm only on it for very specific reasons. And I don't even post my author Instagram. But when you're trying to get people on your email list, because email is king, where do newer authors especially start to look for those people to get them onto their email lists in a way that doesn't suck their soul?
Yeah. So the best way for marketing not to suck your soul is to just say no to social media. This was the big kind of evolution. When I first started teaching authors on book marketing in the late 2000s, social media actually worked, because you had this reverse chronological timeline, and anything you posted would be seen by your fans. And so it's just a matter of getting a lot of likes or fans to your page on Facebook or wherever, and then posting the kind of information that they would get excited about, being funny, being entertaining. And then later, Facebook started introducing algorithms where you had to create kind of good content in order to float to the surface, but it was a game that you could win. And it stopped being a game that you could win in 2016. So we're at 10 years now of social media not working as a general rule. You'll occasionally see authors who are able to make social media work, but it's almost always because they're already famous some other place. And they're able to leverage that fame into a social platform that they can leverage into book sales. But even then, it doesn't always work. Billie Eilish had, I think tens of millions of social media followers, and she sold like tens of thousands of copies of her books. Like her conversion rate was just abominable. And she's a big time celebrity. So that's the first thing, staying off social media. But I actually, when it comes to finding your readers, I have a secret technique here, and that is you don't look for your readers because that leads you in the wrong place. Instead, you try to find a reader, an actual human being, just one who's not related to you, who's a representative sample of your full audience. And then you use that representative reader to answer all of your questions. So you find that representative reader, somebody I call Timothy, which is inspired from a book in the Bible, which was, or two books in the Bible. It was written to a specific guy, Timothy. But millions of people have read those books of the Bible, right? The fact that the book was geared for a specific person didn't make it not appealing for the broader audience. In fact, most books, most great works of literature were written to just an audience of one person. In fact, the author will often say who that one person is, who the one person they've dedicated the book to at the beginning of the book. This is not some new thing I've discovered. It's actually an ancient practice that we have fell out of practice. And so for what you do for writing the book, you write it for the one person, and you also market for the one person. So you find out where that person hangs out online, figure out where and how that person finds out about new books. And then you do whatever you can to be in those places where that Timothy learns about new books. And often that means spending money. And one of the big soul sucking aspects of the social media era was this idea that you could spend time instead of money for marketing. And that's a really kind of broken approach. And instead, the way you need to think of it is in terms of customer acquisition. So I'm spending money to acquire customers. So there's a store and it sells customers for my books or readers for my books. And you build a business around being able to buy readers for less than what you make off of that reader. So if readers cost $4 a reader, so you have to spend, $100 to get 40 readers, then you would, you spend $100 to get. I don't do math live on the air, but anyway. So if readers cost $4 to acquire, then you need to be making a profit of at least $4.01 on your book in order to be able to buy the next reader. And ideally, you want more than that. But if you can be profitable, every reader can buy the next reader, and you just spin that flywheel until you have thousands of readers. And readers get cheaper over time if your writing is good, because they'll come back for sequels, they'll come back for your other books without having to spend as much in advertising.
So that's what you're talking about, is focusing on advertising rather than something like organic social media marketing.
Yeah, organic social media marketing doesn't work for novelists, and it almost doesn't work for nonfiction. It can if you expand your definition of social media towards like blogging and podcast and Substack and YouTube. Those things work a lot better. Like when a lot of people say social media, they think Instagram and Facebook, which have really both become basically TikTok, and those platforms don't work for selling books. And you're like, but what about Book Talk? What about Bookstagram? It's like, those don't work for authors. Sure, there are influencers on TikTok who will dance with your book or talk about how spicy your erotica is. And well, let's be honest, 80% of Book Talk is erotica, right? Everyone acts like it's this thing that's affecting the whole industry, when in reality, TikTok really is about finding, see, a family-friendly way of saying this, your specific proclivities. So the TikTok algorithm, every 50 videos or so, will test you on what your proclivities are. It gets real drilled down, and it tries to anyway figure out what makes you tick, and then it will feed you more and more of that. It doesn't just do it on proclivities, it does it on every interest that you have. And because of that, it's able to match erotica readers with the exact kind of tropes and the kind of erotica that they want to read. But that doesn't mean that your cozy mystery is going to do particularly well on TikTok, particularly if you think you can create content on TikTok that will reach those readers. You're much better off paying the 5 TikTok influencers who are influential on Cozy Mystery $100 each to promote your book. You're $500, and then you're done. You don't have to do any more TikTok, and you've reached all of the readers on TikTok that there are to reach. And you're like, $500, that's a lot of money. Like, no, it's actually less work to go work at Taco Bell and make your $500 and pay the influencers than it is to try to become an influencer yourself.
But on that subject, though, a lot of the barrier to entry of finding those readers with advertising is the cost, especially if you try to start advertising on Facebook, and Facebook just loves to suck your money away and not tell you that they turn on the settings that you told them specifically not to turn on, and then you have to constantly test your ad creatives and the audiences, and so that can by itself become basically a full-time job. So at what point would you say is the best place to start advertising when you like is it your first book? Is it when you have a backlist of multiple books? And if it's multiple, like how many would be the minimum number before you start advertising?
So it the frustrating answer is it depends. And it depends a lot on your book and your audience, like I talked about. I will say, as a general rule, I don't recommend starting with Facebook advertising. Um, I would start with Amazon advertising. So retail advertising, any place where people are already in a mood to buy a book. So being at a homeschool book convention, right? Paying for placement, being there. Because with any kind of advertising as a general rule, you have to convince people to buy a book. And then you have to convince people to buy your book. So it's two big hurdles. But if somebody walks into a Barnes and Noble, they've already decided in their heart of hearts that they're the kind of person who buys books, and today is the day they're going to buy a book. So now it's just a question of which book are they going to buy. And so publishers will spend a lot of money for placement on shelves at Barnes and Noble because it's a target rich environment where they've already gathered book buyers. And so you have to kind of ask yourself, where do book buyers hang out? And the kind of people who doom scroll on TikTok or Facebook or Instagram don't read a lot of books, generally speaking. And the reason they don't read books is because they're being on social media instead. The very act of the thing that they're doing presupposes that they're not doing anything else during that time. And these are activities are often in direct conflict, right? In the evening, I have a quiet moment. I could be scrolling TikTok or I could be reading a book. Now, some people will switch, right? They'll scroll TikTok for a little bit and then they'll put their phone down and pick up a book. And so advertising on social media can work, but advertising to somebody who's shopping for books on Amazon is a much lighter lift because there are people in this world who aren't on social media. I know it's hard to believe. There's actually a surprising number of people who've cut the cord, particularly on the Meta platforms, which are just the worst. Man, Meta, Instagram is brain melting and psychology melting. There's really good research that the anxiety and depression that you're experiencing right now is due to your exposure to the Instagram algorithm. And if you just got off of Instagram, it's more effective as an intervention than therapy. And it's almost as effective as an intervention as walking for 30 minutes every day. So if you have anxiety or depression, I can cure it for 80% of you with just this one advice. Delete Instagram and Facebook off your phone and walk for 30 minutes every day, and you will be cured. You'll be a totally new person after 30 days. It's like a magical cure. It's like, oh, all of this new anxiety that I have from the last 20 years, if I just go back to living the way I lived 21 years ago, it'll all go away. Because 21 years ago, you walked a lot more and you were on Instagram, zero. And you were on Facebook, zero. And you were a happier person, a less worried and troubled person. And so I'm ranting a little bit and we're a little off topic, but seriously, it's magical. It's unbelievable the impact it will have on your mental health.
Oh, for sure. I was talking with EA Winters probably a year or more ago, and she told me about this app called Screen Zen, which limits her time on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and it will like completely block you if you set it that way, where it'll pop up and say you're blocked from this, and if you have the settings correct, you can't open it again for like the rest of the day. So that's really helped me cut the addictive. Oh, there's Facebook. Let's press Facebook because then it'll pop up and say, "Do you really want to do this?" And then it'll unlock it for like 20 minutes.
Yeah, and then that actually becomes a reinforcing habit of where now you just keep giving yourself 20 more minutes, 20 more
You can
minutes.
limit you can limit it. So I
Yeah.
have, and that's really helped me cut how much time I spend on social media. But yeah, you're right. If you can completely uninstall or just even get off those platforms completely. Much better for your mental health.
Yeah. And if you see it as that time I'm spending on social media, I could be spending making money somewhere, doing a job. Because a lot of people spend 4 or 5 hours of screen time every day doing basically content consumption. You could work those 5 hours. Say you get some job for $20 an hour. That's $100 a day. And that's, thousands of dollars a month. That actually gives you a budget for all the things you'd have to pay for. So there's a kind of author who's like, oh, I'm so poor. I have no money. And it's like, do you work a job? No. And get a job.
So going back to the Amazon ads in particular, let's just say there's an author out there who has their first book, it's a sci-fi or fantasy book. Would you recommend they start with Amazon ads on that first book or build a backlist first?
So there's two schools of thought. One school of thought is that you have to have the series because the cost of customer acquisition is too high, where it costs you $5 to acquire the reader and you're only making $4 off of the reader. So you're losing a dollar until you have a sequel, and then you're able to basically make it up with the sequel. So that's one school of thought, and that's where you'll hear this argument. And it can be true depending on the genre. I think that there is a huge demand, an unmet demand, particularly in sci-fi and fantasy, for good standalone books. There's real battered reader syndrome, and a lot of the authors have a postmodern worldview, and they don't know how to end a story in a satisfying way, and so they just keep adding sequels because they know once they get to the ending, it'll be unsatisfying. Because a postmodern worldview, when taken to its logical conclusion, ends in nihilism. That's just the reality of the worldview. Postmodernism leads to nihilism. I've never seen it lead to anything else. It's why everyone's always angry at how these popular postmodern TV shows end, is because they always end in some kind of nihilistic, it's all meaningless kind of way. And and people are always shocked. They're like shocked that they didn't like the boys ending, or shocked that they didn't like the Game of Thrones ending or the Battlestar Galactica ending. I'm like, how else was it going to end? It's a fundamentally postmodern story. And if you know how to tell a classic story or even a modern story, and you know how to stick the landing, I think you can make a standalone book work. And if it's popular, you can write sequels to it. But the sequels also need to have satisfying endings. This whole kind of leaving people hanging can be a real downside for brand new authors, because battered readers, and by battered readers, I mean readers who started series with that they enjoyed, but then the series just ended without finishing. So Game of Thrones is the most famous example. Color of the Wind is another famous example. In fantasy, there's a lot of this. And readers don't like that. They would rather not start a series than start a series they're enjoying and the author doesn't finish. And most authors don't finish most of their series. We don't really notice them because they are kind of obscure and their books didn't sell very well. And that's why you're like, well, gosh, if my last book only sold 50 copies, why should I finish the series? Well, it's like, well, those 50 readers want you to finish the series, and now they're less likely to read the next author's series because they keep reading these brand new authors who keep promising, to be the next Sanderson, and none of them realize they can pull it off. And so you some of the advice that's given by advanced authors is like, oh, you got to have a lot of books, you got to write them really fast. And these beginning authors are just like exhausted. They're like, it took me 5 years to write my first book, So you're saying I have to just sit on it while I write the next book, and and then they launch 3 books that they spent 10 years writing in 3 months, and they get 50 sales, and then they quit. I've seen this quite a bit, because that's terrible advice for somebody just getting started. The advice that you give a more advanced author and the advice that you give a beginning author are very different. So my advice for a beginning author is write the very best book you can, and then don't publish it. Just set it aside. And then write another book. And then once you do that second book, you get it edited and you get it as ready as possible. And then and then maybe publish the second one if you think it's good enough, but maybe set that one aside too. Often the best authors, and by best I mean financially the best, but often with classics as well, they have between 2 and 5 trunk books, which is an old term. Again, a lot of old things I find myself trying to bring back because they were good practices. So in the olden days, when a book existed on physical paper, authors would write it and then lock it in a trunk. A trunk was this like box with a padlock on it. I know kids, you may not know what a trunk is, but it was like this wooden box and
The treasure chest.
a treasure. Yeah, think of a treasure chest. And they would put the book because they couldn't bear to get rid of it because they'd spent, months and months writing it, but they wouldn't publish it. And there is this phenomenon of grandchildren finding trunk books from famous authors and publishing them because it's like, oh, it's a Jules Verne book that was never published. And, the publisher gets all this hype going around the brand new Jules Verne book. And then everyone buys it on opening day because that's the whole marketing strategy because they know on day 4, after people have had a chance to read it, there was a reason why Jules Verne locked it in a trunk because it took practice for Jules Verne to become Jules Verne. He wasn't always Jules Verne, the great author. He was, at one time, Jules Verne, the beginning author, who was still learning how to tell a good story. So you put that second book aside or you publish it, and eventually you go back and you read the first book, and you'll find if you're willing to do this, that you have eyes to see the first book in truth, and you'll see that it's not as good as you thought it was. Because, Colleen, you don't realize this, but all of your episodes are marketing episodes because for fiction, the quality of the writing is actually the most important thing. That's not the case for nonfiction. Poorly written nonfiction books can actually do quite well because in nonfiction, sales are based off of the fame of the author and the promise that the book makes and whether or not it delivers on the promise. So no one really cares if what to expect when you're expecting is well written or not. They only care if it delivers on the promise of, will this help me to know what to expect when I'm pregnant? So as long as it delivers on that promise, the craft is kind of secondary. That's not the case for fiction. I'm either enjoying reading your book or I'm not.
I'm glad you talked about those trunk books, like put it away, don't look at it for a while, because I think today, especially, people want to write a story. They have a story in their head. They crank out the story and decide that they need to publish it if they want to be a successful author, not realizing that they have to go through that process of writing multiple books, writing multiple things to find their voice. So my first book is actually the combination of two really terrible, terrible books, full-length books that I wrote when I was in junior high and high school that I didn't touch for 10 years while I wrote fan fiction. And writing fan fiction helped me develop my voice. So when I finally smashed those two books together and wrote the book that became Mark of Stars, it then went through 3 developmental edits. And I will still go back and read it and be like, shouldn't have done that. Need to change some things. Oh, I did head hopping a lot. So even when you end up publishing that first book, even if it's not the first book, quote unquote, that you've written, you're still going to look back and realize that there's stuff you could have changed.
In fact, you'll often find that the seeds for your whole career were in that first book. This is another mistake authors make, is that every idea they've ever had their entire life, they cram into that first book. And it's like planting a whole bunch of plants too close to each other. It's like there's a whole garden's worth of seeds here, but you're going to have to give them room. And if you let this idea have its own book, you'll find that it becomes a much more mature and interesting and fully fleshed idea. Whereas when it's competing for attention with all the other ideas, it's starving for sunlight and starving for soil and starving for water. And yeah, that first book often has a whole bunch of good books in it, but it's going to have to go into the ground and die first.
Well, it turned into a 4 book series, and then I have multiple prequels. But I'm finding that the more time I spend writing in the world, the more ideas I have for offshoots, spin-offs, standalones, like duologies and things that can keep me busy in that world. And that also goes back to what you said about good standalones. I think if authors can figure out how to write good standalones, but keep them in the same universe, then they're not going to be as stressed out trying to create a new world every time they write a book.
In fact, this was the standard practice for sci-fi originally. So all of Asimov's books are actually in the same universe. So I, Robot, which takes place on Earth, is technically in the same universe as the Foundation series. Now, the Foundation series, half of the series is them trying to find Earth because humanity has spread to the stars so broadly and so much time has gone by that no one actually remembers where Earth is. And there's spoiler reasons for why people are having a hard time finding it. But they're technically in the same shared universe and sometimes will share characters even over tens of thousands of years. And this was also true for Heinlein. So the two godfathers of science fiction shared a universe through a lot of their books. Heinlein wasn't quite as consistent with his world building. I think he had several different worlds, but a lot of his stories shared a literary universe. But you don't know that, right? Reading The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, that feels like a standalone book. The Starship Troopers feels like a standalone book. I, Robot feels like a standalone book. And they all have satisfying endings. They're all written by modern authors rather than postmodern authors. And that really makes a difference, especially in sci-fi, but also in fantasy.
So, something I've talked about with Seth Ring a lot is this idea that when you're starting out, you want to be picking between being a personal brand or a product brand, where a personal brand would be that visibility on social media or in-person events or community-focused engagement, where the people who are buying the books are because they recognize your face, not because they are particularly fond of your writing. And then product brands are going to be the people who like crank out the books. They write them faster. Seth Ring himself does this with his lit RPG books. But they're focused more on the backlist and the cultivating of those longtime readers who don't care what you look like. They just want to read a good book. So, what is your take on this either or split of product versus personal brand? And do you have any advice on how authors can make informed decisions about the trajectory they want their career to go based on that?
I actually see it as very straightforward. If you're writing nonfiction, you're a personal brand. People don't read nonfiction from authors, they read nonfiction from experts. So they have to believe that you know what you're talking about. And people don't read fiction from celebrities, they read fiction from novelists. And even the quote unquote personal brands in fiction are effectively product brands. Think of Brandon Sanderson. Brandon Sanderson has become his own micro genre. Stephen King is his own micro genre, right? Oh, this isn't a horror. This is a Stephen King horror. And so suddenly, you know, if you're familiar with the Stephen King brand, specifically what kind of product you can expect, right? This isn't just going to be scary. It's going to be unsettling and weird and disordered and well written, right? It's all those things. That's what Stephen King is. And you know, oh, this is a fantasy with a Brandon Sanderson, written by Brandon Sanderson with his name on it. You know that it's going to be have a really hard magic system, right? Like what and one enigmatic character who kind of keeps coming out of nowhere and you don't really understand, right? But even if it doesn't have that enigmatic character, it's going to have a hard magic system because who's the king of hard magic systems? Brandon Sanderson. And so so you could say, oh, he's a personal brand because everyone likes him and his name is really famous, but it's like, no, really it's a product brand because there's a set of genre expectations that comes along with a Sanderson book. And if he were to write a book with a soft magic system, it would be a real betrayal of his brand. And I think it would be quite controversial. There's other brand promises that Sanderson makes, and every big name author eventually becomes their own micro genre. And my definition of big name author is has a very specific definition, and it's literally measured in font size. So if you look at a Stephen King book or a Brandon Sanderson book, the font size of the author name is bigger than the font size of the book title because people don't really care, right? They already know what that brand means. And so it's a Brandon Sanderson book I have not read. Shut up and take my money. And that's the goal, right? But you don't start there. If you look at the early Brandon Sanderson books or the early Stephen King books, what word was bigger? Elantris, right? Or for Sanderson, right? Elantris, big, huge font. Brandon Sanderson, really teeny tiny font. Now they've reissued it, and I'm sure they've redone the cover. But initially, the title of the book was much bigger because they were trying to sell people on this obscure author no one had heard of at the time.
That's hilarious. I haven't heard that idea that the big name author means your name is literally bigger on the cover than the title.
And don't think you can shortcut this by like getting your cover redesigned to put your name bigger because it doesn't work if people don't already know what your name means. People have to
Yeah.
already know what your name means. You have to already have readers for the big name strategy to be an effective strategy.
And I'm just looking over at my bookshelf right now, and the first one that pops up is A.G. Riddle. His name, Riddle, on the spine is gigantic, and I cannot tell what the actual title of the book is. I just know it's a sci-fi A.G. Riddle book.
Right.
So does this idea with marketing and advertising and not selling your soul to social media, does that change whether you're going indie or traditional?
So it depends what you mean by traditional, because most people who think they're going traditional are just getting scooped up by an indie author pretending to be a traditional publisher. So, and you can tell what kind of publisher you're working with by how big of an advance you get, because the real traditional publishers are paying five-digit advances, and the indie authors are paying almost no advance or a four-digit advance. So if you're getting a little advance, you're just working with an indie author who's going to use their KDP account to publish your book. And they may have a big brand behind them and look like they're some big operation, but they don't have any money, because if they did, they could afford to pay a bigger advance. And that small publisher, which is the colloquial term for them, I'm being a little mean by calling them indie authors that are pretending to be publishers, but often that really is the case. Maybe there's three or four of them working together, but they're still broke. They're very cash poor. I see that as the worst of both worlds, because if they can't afford to pay in advance, they can't afford to do any marketing. But because they're the publisher, they also don't give you any of the marketing data or any of the control that you need to make the book a success. And so authors with small publishers basically always fail to achieve their goals. I very rarely met happy authors with small publishers unless their goal was to be published with a real publisher. And boy howdy, those authors are thrilled because they're a real boy. They're like Pinocchio, after the strings get cut. But it changes a little bit if you work with a big publisher that's got some real budget, because the big publishers that are willing to put some money behind books, they put often a lot of money behind books. I've worked with publishers. I was working with one author whose publisher basically had a full-time marketing person attached to that author, even on years when he didn't have new books coming out because his backlist was selling so well. And so there's this myth of like, oh, traditional publishers don't pay for marketing. It's like, yeah, they do. If you're successful, they pay a lot of money for your marketing. But most traditional publishers are just indie authors effectively, and they have no money. They're just so poor. And even the big publishers are struggling. So the one of the things we cover on Author Update are industry trends and sales numbers. And traditional publishing has been losing market share every quarter to indie publishing since we started the show. And from what I can tell, traditional publishing has been losing market share for 10 years. It's this like slow drip loss. And even sales overall are down many quarters from their previous years. And even when they're not, they're still down if you adjust for inflation. So traditional publishing is really struggling overall. And we're seeing that there's a lot of consolidations and a lot of publishers going out of business, or fire selling themselves to another publisher to avoid going out of business, and imprints being closed down, etc. But if you're a debut author, you're still expected to do a lot of the marketing yourself to kind of prove to the traditional publisher that you're worth investing in. Because the rule of thumb in this industry is that you put your money on the winning horses. And so you have to convince your publisher that you're a winning horse. And a lot of the mid-list publishers have a real problem of publishing too many books. And their approach is, we'll publish 24 books, and whichever book is doing the best, we'll put all of our marketing money behind that one book, and we'll let the other 23 books just fail. And maybe three or four of them will break even. And so one technique that's more important for traditional authors than for indie authors is the launch. Because not only is your publisher trying to decide if your book is a winner or not, the retail outlets are trying to decide if you're a winner or not. If Barnes & Noble can't sell the copies they have on the shelf in the first 30 days or so, they'll return them to the publisher, and you'll never go on the shelf again. And so your whole career is judged by your performance in those first 30 days. And so you absolutely have to have a really big launch. And we have a whole technique. We used to have a whole course on how to put together a launch. Launches are beneficial for indies, but they are career defining for traditionally published authors. The difference for an indie is that you can have a poor launch and you can still fix it with advertising down the road. If you can figure out profitable advertising where it costs you $3.99 to make $4 on an author on acquiring a reader, and you just keep buying readers, even if you're only buying 20 readers a week, that will turn into hundreds or thousands of readers over time, and you can build up readership and eventually build up a career. if you can profitably advertise. And you don't necessarily need a big launch to make that happen. But most indies can't profitably advertise because their covers are not good enough to work for advertising. It the most important thing on book marketing, and I apologize, we've gone so long into the episode without me mentioning this, is the cover. It affects everything and it's critical, and almost all books have bad covers. And by that, I mean they don't have covers that can lead to a high click through rate on Amazon, on Facebook, where people see that and they instantly know the genre and they instantly know this is a book for them. Most covers are way too pretty and way too ineffective. And it's not about being pretty, it's about convincing people, yes, this is the book for me.
Everything you talked about with the whole traditional versus indie and traditionals not paying their authors a lot reminds me of the episode that you did on the Novel Marketing Podcast, I think 3.5-ish years ago, about the Penguin lawsuit. And I think that was the first episode I ever heard of the Novel Marketing Podcast. I'm like, this makes me feel so validated. I did not go the traditional route because they are not paying anything if you don't have a good launch plan and if you're not marketing on your own.
That's right. The whole industry is governed by what's known as the power law or the Pareto distribution. There's different ways of articulating it, but in nature, there are two statistical distributions, and it's critical to understand both. So I know some of you started zoning out when I said the word statistics. This is not complicated. I need you to come back. Okay. So the standard distribution is the bell curve. That's what everyone thinks the whole world is governed by, but that's not true. There's a second distribution, which is known as the Pareto distribution or the 80-20 distribution. So planets, the size of planets and celestial bodies, stars and constellations and galaxies, whatnot, is not governed by the standard distribution. There's not some average size planet and everything is within one standard deviation away from the standard size planet. Why? Because gravity exists. And the more gravity you have, the more stuff in space you can pull into your orbit and ultimately add to your mass, which then gives you more gravity, which allows you to grab more stuff. And anytime you see a reinforcing cycle, that's what you get the power law from. And it's where you get these winner take all markets. And so people want to read fiction that their friends are already reading. So being popular leads to greater popularity. It's self-reinforcing. It's just like the gravity of a planet. And 90% of the money goes to the top book in a genre, just the one book. And then, so $100, you're splitting it up, right? So 90 of the dollars often goes to just the top book. Now, the top book next week may be a different book. And so you keep slotting out. So over a year, it's not quite this extreme. The next book might get $8. So the number two author is making $8 that week. The number one author is making $100 that week, and everybody else in the genre is splitting the $2. Right, and so it's also known as the long tail, because the discovery 20 years ago was that the long tail, if you can combine enough obscure genres and obscure sales, the long tail can actually be as big as the short head, the 80%, if you get it all. Right. So Amazon doesn't care which books sell because they make money selling all of the books. But that's only from the perspective of Amazon. The author who sells one book a month, while that's contributing to Amazon's profitability, that author still has to have a day job to pay for their family. But the author who's number one in their genre has more money than they know what to do with. It's just money is falling from the heavens for them. And that's how a power law standard distribution works. And this is true in traditional publishing as well. That's why that author I was talking about, their publisher is willing to give them a full-time marketing person because they're in that short head. They're a planet with a big enough gravity where even when he's not publishing a new book that year, his previous books are bringing in so much money, the publisher is happy to pay for a full-time marketing person just to kind of supervise things because it's bringing in so much money. And publishing gets so unbelievably profitable when you have bestsellers. As many of the costs of generating a book, the advance for the author, the copy editing, the developmental editing, the book cover, the typesetting, all of those are fixed costs. And so the more copies you have to amortize, not only does success lead to success from a marketing perspective where people want to read what their friends are reading, but also you're making more profit on the millionth copy of the book than you did on the first copy of the book in a dramatically greater degree of profit. So you're not only selling more books, but you're making more money. And so trying to get to bestseller status is so valuable for publishers. And they're willing to basically gamble because they don't really know how to pick winners particularly well. And most of the time, they're picking losers where they're not getting any sales at all. And that was the big realization of like, wow, I had no idea so many traditionally published books sell a dozen copies or fewer. That's shocking because people who are unpublished think, oh man, if I could just get a contract, I will be successful for sure. It's like, not if you don't have a good launch. If you can't articulate your book well, if you don't have a good cover, and not all traditionally published books have good covers, a lot of them have terrible covers. If you can't convince people to buy your book, it'll just get pulped. The Barnes Noble returns it to the publisher, and the publisher will shred your book, whatever copies they printed, into pulp to print into different books that they can sell.
But that 80/20 rule is also really valuable for indies, especially once you start writing a lot of books. With that backlist, once it grows, 80% of your income is going to be coming from that long tail, whereas the 20% is going to be coming from the recent launches. And so the more books you have, the longer your tail is, the more that your income is going to grow from that long tail. At least that's how I'm looking at it.
So it's actually the opposite. So
Oh,
typically
come
80%
on.
of your money is coming from the
The 20%
recent
that,
sales.
okay.
Yeah. But the 20%, the more books you have in your backlist, the more money you can make off of a super fan. So if
That's
somebody
fair.
buys your
Okay.
most recent book and falls in love with it, and you have 20 more books for them to read, and each of those books are $10, well, you've now made $200 off that one fan. And if it costs you $10 in ads to buy that fan, which is way more than you could make off of any one book, but $10 cost of customer acquisition against $200 of profit, now you're at $190 profit. That's really good. And so that's the way to think of it. But in general, evergreen hits are very rare. They're notable because they're so rare. So sure, 1 out of 1 million books will continue selling in year 2 as well as they sold in year 1. And occasionally you'll find books that actually will grow, where each year it'll sell more copies than the previous year. That is vanishingly rare. There are more professional baseball players than there are books that have that kind of growth. But it does happen. And I've interviewed authors who've had that kind of success. And it is so lucrative because, man, that second year, you have no upfront costs. Just have pure profit.
And yeah, and that's not to say that you can't like pay special attention through like an advertising campaign to resurrect what may be a dead series. I've heard plenty of authors do that where they end up making significant money from a quote unquote dead series because they spent that time to update the keywords, fix the cover, get all of the marketing metadata correct, and then they spend the time and the money to make that series work.
This is one of the advantages of being indie is that you can do that. Traditional publishers will never do that. They'll never kind of revisit an old book and try to breathe life into it. Even though very often the reason a book fails is because it had the wrong cover. In fact, I just interviewed somebody on novel marketing who just could not make ads work. The ads were not profitable. And he followed my advice of split testing book covers. So he was using ads. He paid for a bunch of book covers to get designed. And then he used ads to test the covers, where some people would see one cover, some people would see another cover. And the whole goal was to see which covers got the most clicks. And so he tested like 13 different covers. And he went with the best performing cover as judged by the hundreds of thousands of people on Facebook who saw his cover while they were scrolling past the ads. Right, so which is a great test because that's exactly the kind of competition your book cover is facing on Amazon. Even your own book page on Amazon has 50 other book covers on it, right? You're always competing with a sea of other book covers online and a sea of other book covers at the bookstore and a sea of other book covers at somebody's house, right? They have a stack of books on their bed table and you've got to fight with those other books if you want somebody to grab your book. So he did this test following my advice and his ads went from being unprofitable to being profitable. The book did not change. The only thing that changed was his presentation of the book. And it costs money, right? Those covers cost money, the ads cost money. But now he has an engine that he can just keep running to continue getting readers and build up his platform and his readership. And his notoriety as an author, which is way better than continuing to throw good money after bad, trying to buy readers for a book that doesn't have good product market fit. It doesn't have a cover that signals what the genre is. And for this particular author, he was also in the wrong genre. So this is one of the things. Which category do I pick? Readers often pick the wrong category. And a common mistake for new authors is that they write a book and then try to figure out what category to put it in, which is a terrible, terrible mistake. If you want to make money in this business, you pick the category, you read books, the best-selling books in that category, and then you write a book that fits solidly inside of this category and is not innovating and is not blending categories or merging genres. It's just driving right down the middle of the road. There's so much unmet demand amongst readers for authors who will drive right down the middle of the road that right now, the authors who are doing this are often just using AI to drive down the middle of the road. And they're making tens of thousands of dollars a month, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars a month, because every human author wants to be a special snowflake that's combining genres. And they're just creating the book that the readers want and aren't doing any innovation. They're not trying to create art. They're just trying to satisfy a customer. And there's a lot of money in that.
So for listeners who want to learn more about the novel marketing podcast, do you have a list of like top episodes that people can go to start out with?
I have better than that, actually, because I have a AI bot called AI Thomas. And you have to be a patron of the podcast to get access to AI Thomas, but you can ask any question to AI Thomas and it will give you an answer based off of my 500 plus episodes. And it will give you a list of the best episodes for you for your specific question. So if you're like, how do I launch a book? It'll answer how to launch a book, but then it will say, here are 12 episodes that Thomas has done on launching a book, or how do I grow more email newsletter subscribers, or how do I advertise? So AI Thomas will actually guide you. It'll summarize all those episodes, but also link to the specific episodes, because not every tactic works for every author. And this is why it's so valuable to get that customized advice. You can describe your situation to AI Thomas in as much detail as possible, and then it will help you develop a customized plan for your audience, playing to your strengths and avoiding your weaknesses. So the more information you share with AI Thomas, the better of an answer you'll get. I will say this, while I have super duper privacy on all the other tools that I build for authors, I don't for AI Thomas, because I do use questions people ask AI Thomas for episode ideas. And I state that really clearly. So don't tell AI Thomas anything you're not willing human Thomas to know. All the other tools, though, even I can't read what you upload or what you ask.
That is a really great way to get ideas.
People frustrated that AI Thomas doesn't have an answer is an indication that there's a hole in the kind of suite of podcasts. And it's like, oh yeah, I don't have an episode on that.
But you should.
Yeah, I should. And I will. And sometimes like, oh, I'm not really an expert on that topic. I need to find an expert on this particular topic, and then I'll have an episode. Because it's not, I have solo episodes where it's just me talking, but I also will do interviews where I'll pull in experts on various topics. And like I just did an episode with David Gaughran on Facebook ads, for instance. He's like one of the top people in Facebook advertising. He used to work at Google. He's a really successful indie author. He really understands what he's talking about. He's one of the few people in the space who understands the difference between a neural network and machine learning, which is really important for any kind of advertising conversation because it's all powered by AI now. All of Facebook is AI. Somebody going on Facebook complaining about AI is really funny to me because you're like, everything on Facebook is AI. The content is AI. The algorithm is AI. What you're seeing is determined by AI. it's turtles all the way down.
All right. If people want to connect with you in particular or learn more about Author Media and Author Update, where is the best place to find you online?
Authormedia.com. It has all three of my podcasts, and it also has AI Thomas and the Patron Toolbox and the blog versions of all of my podcast episodes. It's all there at authormedia.com.
Awesome. We'll link to everything in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was really fun talking with you.
Thanks for having me.
All right, everybody. That is it for today's episode. Thanks for joining us. And remember, the first draft is supposed to be garbage. The Novel Writing Podcast is a production of Colleen Mitchell Writes. For more writing resources, including Curios, Tally Inc. author services, and the 60-day novel writing challenge, check out the links in the description.